What's up, class? I'm going to be talking about the home front during World War II. In the last few videos, we talked about the Pacific theater of World War II, and we've also talked about the European theater of World War II. And I want to discuss in this video the war at home, discussing how Americans helped win World War II. Um, so basically, the war was won through the work at home. We outproduced all the other countries combined. We outproduced the Soviet Union, we outproduced Germany, we're really outproducing Japan, and that's what really won the war. The supplies that were produced at home. American manufacturing is myth to get us out of the Great Depression, but it was this narrative is false. The hard labor of Americans really got us out. Wartime propaganda brought many women and men to factories. Images of Rosie the Riveter were posted across the country as a way to get women to join the workforce. It worked. Women came out in the millions. Defense contracting companies made billions because military recruitment was needed for the war. And this has caused a problem till today because these defense contracting companies still sold to the American government, still continue to sell massive amount of military. Like the military spending is 50%, 7% of our budget as a total GDP, and that's all mostly from private contracting companies. So they make a killing out of this. And Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "Watch out for the military-industrial complex," as we see today, continuing. The workers' strikes at home. Not a lot of people know this, but workers saw World War II as an opportunity to fight their bosses for better compensation. Some of the largest strikes in United States history were during this time period. In 1943, Franklin D. Roosevelt had to threaten the draft affirming papers of miners to be thrown out if the strikes did not stop. Throughout the war, federal troops would be deployed to stop workers' strikes over a dozen times. War bonds were a key part of the Allied victory. War bonds are debt securities issued by the government and paid by civilians during wartime. This money is supposed to be paid back later on. Most of it was, but some of it wasn't for these people. Like some of them, if they had bad credit or whatever, they wouldn't get the money that they put in back. More than 85 million Americans purchased war bonds during World War II, adding to a total of 185.7 billion dollars. Posters and propaganda were used during this time to buy into the war. Sorry, I covered that. Um, and what that says is buy war bonds. It was a propaganda slogan used in buying bonds. Rationing. During World War II, the people of the United States rationed food, water, and other supplies to provide for the war effort abroad. Millions of Americans were limited to the amount of goods they could use and consume from 1942 even till after the war in 1946. And it was offered by the federal government as a federal government program. Coupons were distributed to families that allowed them a certain amount of food according to family size. So if you had a big family, you could have more of the sugar intake. Smaller family would get less. It wasn't free market, laissez-faire. You could buy whatever you want. It was government rationing. The effects of the ration system were positive for the war. It's unconstitutional technically to do that, but for the wartime it was good. Families had enough to feed their families and soldiers abroad. Were given proper supplies which allowed the Allies to be successful in World War II. American savings. The average household saved about uh, the most amount of money during World War II. With fewer goods to purchase, and people were rationing, and they couldn't buy goods, and they were suffering from hard times from the Great Depression. So they didn't spend it on all this stuff like leisures. So that allowed them from late 40s and 50s to really have a lot of savings and be able to buy houses and start families and have higher work in factories and have a higher wage. It allowed it to be a prosperous time. And a lot of them got their money back from war bonds, don't forget, too. So savings ahead for these families. American agriculture ingenuity. During the 1930s, the Dust Bowl devastated America's agricultural output, like by 25, 35%, like cut during that time period. And the start of World War II was a really nerve-wracking time for that sector of the country. How would Americans supply enough food for the soldiers abroad and people at home? Well, basically, it's like American ingenuity. Millions of Americans began planting personal gardens to provide for the war effort. These gardens were called victory gardens. They were encouraged by the federal government. And this allowed a huge rise in agriculture to put out in the United States, and it allowed us to win the war to have enough to survive. Um, Wartime propaganda, movies, Hollywood films were another way that the home effort of World War II boosted morale for the United States. Movies like The Great Dictator with Charlie Chaplin seen here, A Yank in the RFA, Underground, The Purple Heart, Back to Bataan, and there was a Bataan during 1942 that was released too, were used as propaganda to demonize the enemy and keep the war effort going strong. Japanese internment camps, and rising racial tensions. Although World War II saw the first battles that blacks and whites fought alongside each other, Iwo Jima, Saipan, my grandfather actually fought along black people for the first. That was the first time in U.S. history fought alongside each other to take an island. It was an extremely bloody battle. I said this in the last one. About 4,000 Americans died, like 19,000 Japanese, and World War II also saw rising. Sorry about that. So rising racial tensions at home. In 1942, FDR ordered internment camps of the Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. 63% of those detained were American citizens. Um, some of them were third, fourth generation. The Japanese were detained until 1945 and lived in the conditions similar to those in Germany, living people in Germany living through the Holocaust. That's not necessarily true to a point. They weren't mass exterminating them, but the quarters weren't very good living. There were like rats there, and rations were low. They weren't. They were. They had school and stuff for them to learn and stuff like that, but it was still really poor conditions. It's like think about a really bad motel. Thinking about a Japanese internment camp, it's kind of what it was. In 1943, race riots in Detroit killed 43. Blacks fleeing from the repressive Jim Crow laws in the South flocked to the North in search of manufacturing work and to live a better life because of lynching rates from 1890 to 1935, 1940, there were about 500 lynchings in the South. So it was really tumultuous time in that time period. But there was fierce opposition from whites, and racism was a rampant thing widespread across the country. It was indoctrinated in them. Um, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had Burns in his cabinet, who was a Southern segregationist, and even Harry Truman was known to use the N word a lot. He wasn't a fan of black people, so it was just the time period was totally different. War's End and America's economic boom. So this is the last slide we're going to be going over. And on August 7th, 1945, as we know, the war was declared over. And I didn't put it in this video because I said it in the last two. It was the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, which ended the war. Millions across the globe, the world celebrated the world's deadliest conflict. One nation, more than others, came out especially victorious, and that's the United States. After its atomic power and just the fact that it wasn't harmed during World War II, the mainland wasn't, it was Pearl Harbor, and then there was one little bomb that exploded, the Japanese blimp that exploded over Oregon, but it didn't do any damage. So the United States was unscathed, and it had high paying jobs, and it saw an expansion into America's suburbs, a suburban lifestyle. It would all collapse later on in the 1960s, which we'll get to in later units. But the baby boom was allowed for the largest birth per woman in American history. So that's it, guys. You just got to study for this test. World War II, it's coming up soon, and yeah, thank you.